Hello, Year 11. This is the prediction paper for 2026 for superpower relations and the Cold War. Now, obviously, this is based on looking at all the data from the previous years, what questions have come up before, and what hasn't appeared for a while. Don't just assume this is the only things you need to revise. That's not the case. But these are things that could potentially come up, okay? So make sure you're revising everything, but these are things that could come up. So, welcome to the Walking and Talking mock. So the first questions on this paper are your explain a consequence question. So remember, your second order concept that you're focusing on is consequence. So what happened as a result of something? So what happened after? Because it's asking you to explain. You kind of want to do it as a what, how, why paragraph, or if you prefer, your pill paragraph. That is how you want to answer this question. This is an access question, so examiners give you marks based on if there's something correct in there, because they don't give you any information to help you. So if you get it roughly right, you will get a mark. What I've said to all of you as a go-to thing that you can write about is about either an increase or decrease in tension. If you write that, then you guarantee yourself 2 marks for these 2 questions. So, explain the consequence of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This is something that takes place in 1979, so towards the end of the Cold War, but arguably the start of the Second Cold War. So we are looking for a consequence of this invasion. It's a 4-mark question, so we don't want to spend any longer than 5 minutes. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time, because remember, you do this paper at the same time as you do your Elizabeth paper. So the bits that I'm going to write in red is going to be kind of the question and answer stem that you can use for this style of question all the time to guide your answer. So always start it with the wording of your question in the answer. So, 1 consequence of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was the Carter Doctrine. So we've stated 1 consequence. That would get us 1 mark because we've given them a correct piece of information that shows we have our own knowledge. But now we need to kind of describe what this is. The Carter Doctrine was a retaliation to the invasion from the USA. It stated that they will economically sanction the Soviet Union and that they would supply weapons to the Mujahideen. So that's my detail there. I could go into more specifics about those economic sanctions. I could go into more depth about the weapons for the Mujahideen, but there's no point because it's a 4-mark question. Your explanation needs to be kind of bigger and in more depth than the description. So the next part we're going to do, once we've stated it, we're going to say the impact. And we know we can always go to an increase in tension, because the whole of the Cold War is about an increase or decrease in tension. So this resulted in an increase in tension between the superpowers can't just leave it there. We need to make sure we're adding the word because otherwise this is not a developed explanation. So this resulted in an increase in indirectly going against Soviet control of Afghanistan. And that would get you 4 marks. Woo! So our next question is explain a consequence of the Berlin blockade. So this is where you've got to make sure that you're focusing on kind of the correct aspect of Berlin, because remember there are 2 crises. You've got your first crisis, 1948, 49, and then you've got your second crisis from about 1959 to 1961. So anything to do with the blockade, you need to remember is the first crisis, and it's in 48. Okay, so again we're going to start it the way we always do with this question. One consequence of the Berlin blockade was, this is quite an easy one, the Berlin airlift. Normally in the paper there's always something on Berlin, it's just making sure you know the right one. This would get us 1 mark because it's a correct piece of information and it's a correct consequence, and it's not giving us any clues about what we need to include. So now we need to describe the airlift. You should all know the number of flights because I've told you so many times. This was when the USA flew supplies over Berlin over the course of 10 months and 275,000 flights. So strong knowledge there. Now we need to do our explanation. So what does this result in? This resulted in, because remember it's a consequence, the blockade failing. But I need to develop this, so I need to say because. So this resulted in the blockade failing because Stalin could not starve Berlin into submission. Because remember that was his aim. If he blocked off the roads and starved them into submission, all the West would leave. So because Stalin could not starve, because Stalin could not starve Berlin into submission. This increased tension, so we can always link it back to that if we're unsure if we've got enough, between the superpowers, because making sure we develop the USA were seen as victorious and the Soviets were seen as oppressive. Amazing, we've got 8 out of 32 already. Imagine if you can just do that for the rest of the paper. Okay, let's go to our next question on the paper. Now this is probably one of the harder questions out of all the papers because it's a little bit vague in what it wants you to do, and the command words are very, very different to what you are used to. This is question 3 on the paper, and it will always start with this kind of same stem. Write a narrative account analysing. So what this means, narrative, in this case, is going to have to be in chronological order. So that's really key. If you don't know dates, don't write the dates. Just make sure you roughly know what comes first and then what comes after. If it's an account, it's not a story, you've got to get straight to the point. So the facts, but what you've got to do with these facts and these events is analyse how they link together. So how does one event lead to the next? Now sometimes it will give you a whole time period, so it might say analyse the key events from 1941 to 1945, or it will give you kind of a large event that happens. So for example, Prague Spring could be one, Cuba could be one, Hungary could be a question, all of these for example. But you have to kind of write a lot and write in a specific way to be able to get those 8 marks. So let's show you how. So it will give you some guidance on what you could use. So it might say you may use the following in your answer: satellite state, Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now the points they give you here are normally already in chronological order, so it's worth mentioning those. But you have to mention at least one other thing, one other event, to be able to kind of get beyond that level 2. Okay, so use that, know that that's in chronological order, so you should be writing it in that order, but also use information of your own. So again, I'll try and use the red pen to show roughly the type of language and kind of the linking words that you can use regardless of the question. So we can start it with this begun. With Czechoslovakia being or becoming a satellite state of the USSR. So under the USSR, Czechoslovakia had very little personal freedom and there was a lot of censorship and oppression. So what I've started to do already is I've outlined the kind of the cause of the Prague Spring. So this is my first paragraph, is always going to be on the cause, so kind of why it begun. So this began with Czechoslovakia becoming a satellite state of the USSR. Under the USSR, Czechoslovakia had very little personal freedom and there was a lot of censorship and oppression. So now I want to say the impact of this. This had an impact. So just using that phrase can potentially show that you're starting some form of analysis which can help push you into that level 2, level 3 band. This had an impact on the Czech people as they were unhappy with Soviet rule and protested about it. No, I'm not using flowery language, I'm just getting straight to the point because that's all you need. So now this is then going to lead to kind of Dubček coming into power here. So I'm going to show how that starts to connect. So you want to try and order it in 3 paragraphs, but it's a little bit tricky to do. So this is going to kind of be my event. So as a result, this is kind of the linking language we're using to connect the Czech people's unhappiness to Dubček obtaining power. So as a result of their unhappiness. Brezhnev, so the leader of the Soviet Union, allowed Dubček to lead Czechoslovakia. Dubček was put in power in order to please the people and make communism more popular. So I've done quite an in-depth explanation there to why he's been put in power and how that's going to link back and help the people. So he introduced reforms such as an end to press censorship. End to press censorship. Trade with the West and more personal freedom. I don't need to write absolutely everything down because then my description is going to be too heavy, where I need to actually get that analysis a little bit more. So again, I'm going to say this resulted in, showing that linking, the Czechs feeling positive about this new socialism with a human face. So this kind of more humane version of communism. But we know already anything that gives people more freedom, the Soviet Union aren't going to like. So this is going to lead on to our third paragraph. So we're going to say, however, this was a threat to the Soviet Union, and the word that we need to make sure we keep using is because otherwise our analysis doesn't get anywhere. This was a threat to the Soviet Union because it's focused on capitalistic ideals rather than communism. It gave the people in Czechoslovakia an insight into Western freedom, which could impact the stability of the USSR. So this is going to link to my third paragraph. If I ever forget to make a new paragraph, all I need to do is just do those two lines. So now I need to connect this to my next events, which is the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and the Brezhnev Doctrine. So due to this threat, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia with 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops. So now I need to explain how this stops the threat. This stopped the threat as the USSR demanded the reforms be reversed, and they were able to restore strict control over Czechoslovakia. And obviously Prague Spring wouldn't be complete if you didn't write about Brezhnev Doctrine. So further to this, Brezhnev introduced the Brezhnev Doctrine, which said the USSR had the right to invade any communist country that essentially kind of moved away from communist ideals. What I do at the end of this question always is try and link it back to tension, because that's quite important, and also an easy way to show some form of analysis. So we're going to go back to the impact of this was an increase in tension between the satellite states and the USSR, as the East realized that they had very little chance of escaping communism. Not being subjective, but this is definitely an 8 out of 8, so that means we've definitely got 16, and that's half marks. And if you get half marks roughly on each paper, that basically gives you a level 4, which is a good pass grade. So let's get on. So now I need to kind of explain how his thinking led to the end of the Warsaw Pact. So let's go with glasnost meant that countries were now aware of the atrocities completed largely under Stalin, so we're just going to put his name, under Stalin, and realised that communism was not ideal. This resulted in non-communist groups such as Solidarity in Poland pushing away from communism, this was further supported by Gorbachev's dismissal of the Brezhnev doctrine, meaning countries didn't have to worry about going against the USSR, as they would no longer be invaded. Thus, the satellite states started to leave the Warsaw Pact. Now I need to link it back to that question, because remember that question is, why is it important for the end of the Cold War? So this was important for the end of the Cold War, as the USSR no longer had a military alliance competing with the USA. This reduced the likelihood of war and helped the Cold War to end, as there was less tension. There was less tension between the superpowers. So remember, if you're always stuck, link it back to tension, but make sure you get it the correct way around. That's one paragraph. My second paragraph, we can link it to basically any consequence of his new thinking. So we're going to go with, let's go with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So again, we're going to start our sentence with the wording of the question. So Gorbachev's new thinking also, no, I've changed my mind, we're not going to do Berlin Wall. Let's do something that we often forget about. Let's focus on arms race and space race. Gorbachev's new thinking also resulted in the end of the arms and space race due to perestroika. So perestroika is restructuring, so we've already mentioned that, so you don't have to do it again. Due to perestroika, Gorbachev recognized the Soviets needed to focus their money domestically rather than on foreign policy. They also realized trading with the West would be beneficial and help improve the standard of living in the USSR. Now, I know this paragraph is a bit shorter because I got a bit carried away about the Brezhnev Doctrine, but it still works. So this was important, so I'm going to go back to this was important for the end of the Cold War, as the USA and USSR were now working together and not competing over weapons, reducing the tension between the superpowers and resulting in a natural end to the Cold War, as the USSR were allowing capitalism into their country. So essentially, there's no reason to fight. Lovely. Now, let's do the final one. So we're going to focus on Cuban Missile Crisis, the importance of the Cuban Missile Crisis for superpower relations. So again, just like I did last time, I'm going to outline what the Cuban Missile Crisis was. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was when the USA spotted missiles being placed on Cuba by the Soviet Union, resulting in a severe threat of nuclear war. Done. That's my overview. Now I need to say why it was important for superpower relations. So the first thing we're going to go to is it's important in terms of the reduction in nuclear weapons. So one reason the crisis was important for superpower relations was because it reduced the amount of nuclear weapons that the superpowers had. So I need to kind of explain how the missile crisis resulted in this. So the crisis resulted in the world being extremely close to war, which was a significant problem. MAD, so mutually assured destruction, meant that they would both destroy each other, which was not an effective way to win a war. They also recognized the danger and wanted to reduce this. So that's why they connected to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this resulted in treaties such as the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which meant the superpowers could not test weapons in space or underwater. They also reduced the amount of overall nuclear weapons they had. Now I need to show the impact. So this was important for relations as it reduced tensions as they were working together to make the world safer. No, that's nice, isn't it? Second paragraph. So the missile crisis was also important for relations as it led to better communications between the superpowers. The telephone hotline was created in 1963. This allowed for direct communication. The hotline was created in 1963. This allowed for direct communication between Moscow and Washington. This was important as it meant in future crises the two superpowers could reach each other quickly and directly, reducing the likelihood of misinterpretation of information and making issues easier to solve. This ensured relations between the superpowers were positive, reducing previous tension. I think we might have done it. Now, that is our Cold War paper done. Have a go at them yourself. maybe try the topics in different forms of questions. Maybe put Afghanistan as a narrative, maybe put Cuba as a narrative. Switch them around, but remember this is all about consequences, so you need to know it. Thanks, bye.